After my grandmother's funeral, someone placed a sealed letter in my hands and whispered, "She wanted only you to read this." I thought it held a goodbye. I was wrong. One page changed everything I believed about my family. My name is Olathe Winterhawk. I am a wildlife rehabilitator in Montana. I trusted my family with my whole heart until one letter showed me who had betrayed me. The air at the gravesite was thin and biting, a typical Montana chill that seeped into my marrow. My grandmother, the matriarch who had anchored our fractured family for decades, was finally laid to rest under the shadow of the Absaroka Range. I stood there, clutching my coat, my vision blurred by a grief that felt heavy, physical, and suffocating. People drifted around me, a sea of black wool and muted murmurs, but I felt untethered. As I turned toward the parking lot, an old acquaintance of my grandmother's, a woman whose face was etched with the same deep lines of time that my grandmother possessed, pressed a heavy, cream-colored envelope into my palm. Her eyes were sharp, searching, and filled with a somber intensity that made my breath hitch. "She wanted only you to read this," she whispered, the wind nearly snatching the words away. I clutched the envelope against my chest, the paper cool and stiff. The weight of it felt ominous, a sharp contrast to the gentle handwritten script of my name on the front. I retreated to my truck, driving the long, winding road back to my cabin in the woods. Every mile felt like a march toward a cliff. I didn't want to open it, not yet. I wanted the memory of her final, peaceful smile to remain unblemished. But as I sat on my porch, surrounded by the quiet chirping of birds and the rhythmic swaying of the pines, a cold dread pooled in my stomach. It wasn't the grief of loss anymore, it was the sharp, metallic taste of fear. I felt, with a clarity that defied logic, that the life I had known up until this afternoon was about to dissolve into smoke. I broke the wax seal, my fingers trembling so violently that the paper crinkled loudly in the silence of the porch. As I began to read, the world didn't just stop, it tilted on its axis. The words were written in my grandmother's shaky, elegant hand, but they carried the weight of a confession. She spoke of a hidden account, of property rights that had been systematically stripped away, and of a man, my Uncle Elias, who had orchestrated it all behind a mask of doting, familial devotion. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I read the passage again, my eyes scanning the ink until the lines blurred. Elias had been the one to handle her estate planning for the last decade, claiming he was protecting her assets from outside litigation. The letter detailed how he had systematically funneled funds into his own ventures, all while telling the rest of us that the accounts were dry. She had known for years, she wrote, but she was trapped. She feared him. She feared what he would do if she tried to leave, and she feared the disintegration of the family if the truth came to light while she was alive. I felt the foundation of my childhood crumbling. Every memory of Elias, the jovial uncle who brought me gifts from his travels, the man who had comforted me when my mother passed, suddenly felt like a script in a poorly acted play. I stared out at the rugged, untamed mountains, but I couldn't see the beauty anymore. I only saw the duplicity. Every holiday dinner, every shared secret, every word of advice he had ever given me was poisoned. My grandmother hadn't just left me a letter, she had left me a battlefield. The next few days were a blur of forced normalcy. I went to the rehabilitation center, checking on the red-tailed hawk with the wing injury, but my mind was elsewhere. I moved through my tasks with a mechanical, eerie efficiency. I started attending the family gatherings that followed the burial, my eyes fixed on Uncle Elias. He was the same as he had always been, loud, gregarious, and seemingly heartbroken. He patted my shoulder with that familiar, heavy hand, asking about my work with the raptors. I forced a smile, my cheeks burning with the effort. "You're quiet, Olathe," he noted, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his designer glasses. "Grief takes time. Don't let it turn you into a stone." "I'm just tired, Elias," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was screaming. "Just trying to make sense of everything." He chuckled, a sound that now sounded like grinding glass. "We all are." But she left us in good shape. That's what matters. I turned away, my knuckles white as I gripped a glass of water. He didn't know I had the letter. He didn't know that I had already begun digging through the old family archives in the basement, pulling out documents that I had ignored for years. I cross-referenced dates, account numbers, and property deeds. The deeper I looked, the uglier the picture became. The official story he had given the family, that the estate had shrunk due to bad investments, was a blatant lie. The money hadn't vanished. It had moved. I found emails, ledger notes, and lawyer correspondence that painted a picture of a man who viewed our family history as nothing more than a source of capital to fund his failing business ventures. The most disturbing part was how many people seemed to have looked the other way. I wondered, as I sat in the dim light of the study, if my father had known. I wondered if he had ignored the signs to avoid the shame of a confrontation. The silence of the house felt heavy, filled with the ghosts of secrets that had been fed and watered for years. Every time a floorboard creaked, I expected Elias to walk through the door, his mask finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. I started spending my evenings in the attic, surrounded by the dust of decades. My grandmother had been a meticulous record keeper, but there were holes in her archives, deliberate gaps where folders were missing and ledgers had been cut out. It was as if someone had gone through with a scalpel, removing the evidence of their crimes. But she had been smarter than they knew. She had left small breadcrumbs, obscure references in her journals to dates and places that didn't align with the official record. I found a box hidden behind a false panel in the old cedar chest. Inside were receipts for private investigators and copies of legal notices that my uncle had claimed were never received. My breath hitched as I realized he hadn't just stolen money, he had effectively kidnapped her legacy, holding her autonomy hostage under the guise of family duty. I sat on the floor, the smell of cedar and history swirling around me. I felt a cold fire ignite in my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the desecration of the woman who had raised me. Someone had tried to erase her history, to rewrite her life as a story of decline and foolishness. I decided in that moment that I would not let that stand. The trail was messy, buried under layers of corporate jargon and familial obligation, but I would follow it to the end. The mask began to slip in small, almost imperceptible ways. At a family luncheon, I brought up the old ranch property on the edge of the valley, mentioning a rumor I'd heard about its zoning status. Elias's response was immediate and sharp. That property was sold years ago, Olathe. It's not worth talking about. You're getting distracted by fairy tales. I just find it interesting, I said, keeping my tone light, almost bored. I saw an old map yesterday, and it looked like the ownership was still listed under Grandma's trust. His fork clattered against the fine china. For a second, his face went rigid, his eyes flashing with a spark of genuine anger that he quickly suppressed. Maps can be wrong. Paperwork is tedious. Don't waste your energy on things that don't concern you. You're right, I agreed, offering a soft, compliant smile. I'm sure you know better than anyone. Watching him walk away to refill his drink, I felt a strange sense of clarity. He was arrogant, so deeply convinced of his own brilliance that he couldn't imagine me as a threat. He viewed me as a wildlife rehabber, a quiet, soft-hearted woman who spent her days feeding baby owls and mending broken wings. He didn't see the hawk, the predator that watches and waits. I was learning his rhythm, the way he shifted his weight when he was nervous, the way he deflected questions with a mixture of charm and condescension. He was getting sloppy, blinded by his own sense of victory. I was no longer just the niece grieving a grandmother, I was the architect of his exposure. The financial records I pulled were devastating. I found a string of offshore accounts registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a company whose mailing address was a post office box in his own residential neighborhood. The sheer scale of the theft was sickening. It wasn't just the inheritance, it was the pension funds she had saved for her siblings and the educational trusts for the younger cousins. He had treated the family's collective future as his own private slush fund. As I sat at my computer, The glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dark of my office, I felt a tremor of fear. If he knew what I had, he wouldn't hesitate to discredit me, or worse. I had seen the way he could twist narratives. I had seen him ruin the reputations of business rivals with a few well-placed rumors. I had to be careful. Every file I downloaded, every record I printed, I saved in triplicate in different locations. My hands didn't shake anymore. They were focused, steady, and cold. I began to understand my grandmother's fear, but I also understood her strength. She hadn't left me the letter because she was a victim. She had left it because she was a fighter who had simply run out of time. The last missing piece was found in the most unlikely of places, the old hollow oak tree at the back of the property, a spot where we used to play hide-and-seek when I was a child. I remembered her telling me once, "If you ever need to find the truth, look where the roots go deepest." I climbed the ridge, my boots sinking into the wet mud. Inside the hollow of the tree, wrapped in a waterproof pouch, was a digital drive and a handwritten ledger, the unedited, untampered account of every transaction Elias had ever made. When I plugged the drive into my laptop, the files opened like a skeleton key. There were recordings, too, voice memos she had made, documenting their conversations, his threats, and his admissions. As I listened to his voice on the recording, arrogant and demanding, the final shroud of doubt evaporated. He was the one. He had betrayed us all, not just with greed, but with a cold, calculated cruelty that defied belief. I sat back, the house silent around me. The weight of the truth was immense, but it was also solid. I knew exactly what I had to do. The fear remained, a constant companion, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. It was the fuel. The next week was a whirlwind of careful preparation. I met with a lawyer who specialized in forensic accounting, a woman recommended by a friend from my college days. I laid everything out, the letter, the documents, the drives, the recordings. She looked through the evidence, her face growing more serious with every passing minute. "Olathe," she said, looking up from the desk, "this is a massive amount of evidence. This isn't just civil malpractice, this is criminal. If you go forward with this, there is no coming back." "I know," I replied. "I don't want to come back." I spent the next 3 days organizing the files, creating a timeline, and preparing a presentation for the family. I didn't want this to happen behind closed doors. I wanted the truth out in the open, where it couldn't be whispered away or explained into oblivion. I reached out to my father, my voice steady as I told him we needed a family meeting and that it was non-negotiable. He sounded hesitant, confused by my tone, but he agreed. When the day of the meeting